rays, a phenomenon that fuses destruction and creation, resulting in revival. For Chojin, it is a fundamental power. Use of their abilities breaks down their bodies. They overcome their humanity to the point of harm. That is what makes them Chojin. Their pseudo-deaths harm their own humanity. The more often they confront death, the more Chojin-like they become and less human. However, through repeated maiming and revival, Tokyo has long since reached his limit. We have somewhat reached the conclusion of the Tokyo and Azuma fight in a very spectacular way, and I was extremely interested to see how this would actually happen. Originally, I thought the Commander General Sandik, I believe his name was, would ultimately come in, save the day, or break them apart, something like that, right? But what we got instead was something far greater, something that really puts into perspective where this story wants to go and what Ishida wants to do. This duality, this relationship, this friendship, this rivalry between Tokyo and Azuma is only just beginning, yet it has been framed in probably the most heartbreaking and tragedy-driven way you could possibly imagine. That these two eventually, consistently, repeatedly, will most likely fight to the death. But this newest chapter has changed that idea just a little bit. Originally, we were led to believe that Azuma would be the one that Tokyo would fight for. That Azuma was the one that needed to be saved. That Azuma, being so lost within his Chojin form, being this faceless, corrupt hero, needed that desperate help. But in actuality, it's Tokyo that is changing. The constant state of maiming and revival that he is going through within his Chojin form is drastically distorting his humanity. It is turning him more into a Chojin, more into this evolutionary process, and it's taking away his human nature. We didn't know this before. We didn't think this was going to be a thing, but now that it's within the picture, it makes a lot more sense. Potentially the one that could actually save Tokyo from becoming something far greater or far worse, depending on your perspective, could be Azuma. But to even get to that point, Azuma has to go a very long way. He has to find himself. He has to figure himself out and decipher all of these conflicting emotions he has towards not only himself, but towards Tokyo. It's why his Chojin form is weird to begin with. Faceless, shirtless, morphing into different abilities, and being fueled by so much back-end emotion. Personally, I love this idea. It's something that Sui Ishida is really great at doing when it comes to pitting two different characters against one another. These are two childhood friends. They are extremely different, emotionally, mentally, physically. Their Chojin abilities represent them in completely different ways as well. Yet one is falling down a path of an evolutionary process that seems like where the Chojin ability wants to go. This next step, this next iteration, quote unquote. And we've seen the very earliest stages of it. Tokyo transforms into something that we have not seen before. A very ominous and somewhat even godlike figure, but you can tell that it's drastically incomplete. It's formed, it's created, it's extremely powerful. He has 3 arms, he's kind of faceless himself, his body has completely changed, but it's not complete. And I can imagine the more this pseudo-death and revival keeps happening, this will drastically evolve further and further, most likely to the point of no return. We've seen slight variations of this for Chojin already, not to the extent of the ascended godlike being that Tokyo turns into, but more so out of control, losing themselves. Do you remember the baseball guy? He's kind of a prime example of someone losing control, allowing their emotions to overflow them so heavily and drastically where they can't coherently return back to human nature. We actually seen Azuma himself slowly transition into this form before getting knocked out of it by a car within this very fight. Tokyo has gone through the other version of this and losing his humanity, being propelled so much by his emotions but also dying at the same time and reviving, has stripped him of his emotions and he has somewhat quote unquote transcended. For me currently, the question that comes with this is how many other Chojin can do this? Could Azuma do this? Could other Chojin abilities do this? Or is it just specifically centered towards Beast Chojin? The reason I mention Beast Chojin is because a while back we got introduced to what I think a lot of us call the Mother, and it was this Chojin-like being that looks very different. It's probably the most abnormal thing we've seen within the story that is very ethereal, very godly, very weird and all over the place, right? It's not a normal thing within this story. And we found out that the smoke guy, whose name I cannot remember, was actually working for her. This thing or this Mother is looking for Tokyo and looking for Beast Chojin Chojin specifically. Depending on the translation and interpretation, she calls them her children, that the Beast Chojin are her children, and it makes me think that whoever does get a Beast Chojin ability has the opportunity, potentially, to do what Tokyo just done, to let the animalistic side of things take control, to regress from human nature and transcend into a higher purpose, to lose their humanity and to evolve and finalize themselves within a Chojin-like state, the purest form of Chojin, so to speak. That's currently my train of thought, that the mother that we've seen wants her beast children back, whether to amplify herself or to guide her children, I'm not entirely sure, but there's definitely a lot more here, and Ishida has been setting up these stones very specifically, very carefully, to make sure that this story can be a long-lasting one. Would it be the same length as Tokyo Ghoul or Tokyo Ghoul Re? I'm not entirely sure. With how flexible and creative he can be, the length of Chojin X could be anything. There's no set amount of pages that he can write within a chapter. So at one hand, we can get 30 pages or 60 pages within a singular chapter. And while the release schedule is whenever he's finished is a little bit rough for some people, this provides the most flexible and most creative storytelling that you can actually get. Not a lot of authors have this opportunity, so Ishida is doing it at his best, the healthiest rate he can, and telling the story that he wants to tell. The biggest difference, and something that I feel like you'll notice throughout Chojin X, is that he's not going to be impeded by corporations, by requirements, by all of these negative effects that come with a weekly publication to the monthly release, bi-weekly, whatever it may be. There's a lot of choices that he changed within Tokyo Ghoul and Tokyo Ghoul Re, very massive ones, for characters, for deaths, for complete outcomes. The final arc of Tokyo Ghoul was theoretically meant to be entirely different, but because of a lot of different circumstances, his burnout, his feelings, and how that all kind of rotates around this very stressful weekly release schedule, he couldn't find himself happily or creatively writing the ending that originally he might have intended. That's how drastic of a change stress can be. So on the positive side, you're now reading a story by him that doesn't have that influence. There's no requirements. There's no schedule that he has to release to, so all of his creativity, all of his choices are entirely his own, and they can be very drastic, very tragedy driven, very saddening. And it would definitely seem like he's putting into motion a very brutal relationship that's going to evolve and expand over a very good period of time, and most likely end with one of these two dying. This fight is just the opener for it. It's the catalyst. It's the start of these events. It's the start of Tokyo's spiral into a humanless nature and potentially transcending into the next evolution of Chojin, and Azuma potentially trying to redeem himself, trying to find his own identity and become the hero to save Tokyo again. In this chapter, Azuma recognizes that he is no longer Tokyo's hero, and that's a sad reality that he's had to come to learn. But now that story has framed itself this way with Tokyo, the only person that can bring Tokyo's humanity back, if he ever gets to that point, is Azuma, his own personal hero. So this is all just a collection of my thoughts and where I feel like the future of Chojin X is actually going, but the chapter itself was very beautiful. Incredible artistry, great use of words and development and character growth, and just seeing all of this emotion kind of pour onto Azuma's face once it's revealed is heartbreaking. This self-realization of one another and where their paths will intertwine and eventually go towards. Even though this fight has concluded, this has opened up and allowed Ishida to spread his wings very far, and the future for Chojin X is looking brilliantly bright. I'm not too sure when the next chapter is going to release. I'm not too sure where the direction of the story is going to go, but we are building up for some very massive things, and this story is only just beginning. But of course, it wouldn't be a Sue Ishida story if it wasn't filled with this heartbreaking relationship with two very powerful characters that are such great friends at each other's throats, that are two different sides of humanity, two different sides of human nature, and they will fight and they will conflict until potentially one of them dies. I don't know if or when we'll ever get to that point, but I do know it's going to be a very emotional, fulfilling, and beautiful journey through and through. For whatever reason, if you have not caught up to Chojin X, if you're waiting and buying your time for more chapters to release, I do think now is a great time to catch up. Go through and read the catalog that's currently out, and even though it is small, it's packed, filled with so much incredible stuff that you can indulge within that will provide a very enjoyable experience. experience. And the story forward is going to be nothing but phenomenal. I can promise you that. So if you've made it this far, thank you. I appreciate you. Drink plenty of water, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you within the next one. Goodbye.